Hi, this is Mike Spivey of the Spivey Consulting Group. It is February 2nd, 2021. And I'm going to be talking today about why people underperform their numbers. We did a podcast last year, why people overperform their numbers. I think that would be a good one to listen to, and we'll link it. But the interesting thing here is it's not like you could see a scenario where it would be entirely the inverse, right? Do the things that people do to overperform the numbers, and don't do those things if you don't want to underperform. But it's not quite the inverse. And there were some great questions on Reddit, one of which, just to get right to it, because I do want to talk about this, will more people underperform their numbers this cycle versus previous cycles? The answer is probably yes. I don't know how else to say that. I just want to be transparent, particularly as, you hear a lot this cycle from entities trying to keep everyone calm. Everyone's so fixated on, you need to keep the market calm, that I think there's a lot of miscommunication coming from people who sound like authorities. But the fact of the matter is we're in the middle of the most competitive cycle I've ever seen in my lifetime. And many schools have application increase unlike they have ever seen before. So I do think we're going to have people underperform their numbers. The hope of this podcast, and I don't want to overrate how much influence we can have, but maybe the hope is that in some of these scenarios, you can course correct so that in certain situations, if you're underperforming, you can do some minor changes and get some more admits. But there was another question, which was, can you define what underperforming means? And that was a wonderful question, because I think when I wear my admissions hat too often, I forget that, I see numbers as target medians. So when I look at a 165 and a 3.55 from a school last year, I don't think of that as their medians. I think of that as their historic medians. It's also incidentally why I don't put one of those numbers predictors up on my website. Obviously, for a business reason, that would drive traffic to our website. It wouldn't cost us much money or hardly any money. And we have lots of data, but the data is always historic and not really relevant to the current cycle. So I'm not talking about underperforming because some website says you have a 60% chance of getting in based on historic data. What I mean is this. And I'm going to speculate a little bit, but I mean, it's based on 21 years of experience, so hopefully it's pretty accurate speculation. Looking at the data today, if I were a top, 1 to 10 school, I'd be looking at +1, maybe even in a rare case, +2 median LSAT, and maybe my GPA going up from a 3.82 to a 3.85. Those are target medians. If I were a school in the top 20, I might be looking at a solid +2. And there's going to be, because I've talked to some, schools outside the top 20 who are looking at +3 and even +4 median LSATs. And with some decimal place upgrade GPA too. So when I say underperform, what I really mean is, if I'm talking to you one-on-one and you have a 177 and a 4.0, and I say, yeah, apply to the top 6, and you're not getting into any of those schools, you are emphatically underperforming. If you have a 169 and a 3.9 and Emory and Vanderbilt just denied you, you're underperforming, because it would be our calculation that your numbers are above their targets. So hopefully that answers the, please define underperforming. This incidentally happens every cycle. So every cycle, understandably so. There's a number of posts online that say, there's some with a little bit of snarkiness, but they're also like 75 to 80% accurate. Hey, law school admissions is literally just about numbers, your LSAT and your GPA. And that happens at the beginning of the cycle. Every cycle, it'll continue to happen for any foreseeable future. But the interesting phenomena, for lack of a better word, is at the end of the cycle, you see the opposite effect. You see a lot of people saying, I'm going to have to apply next year because I had these strong numbers and didn't get in. So it's the delta between those two time spaces that hopefully this podcast will be helpful, because we'd rather not see as many of those posts at the end of the cycle, and there's going to be some. People do underperform their numbers, and often it's in a certain set of categories. The first and obvious one that comes to mind is character and fitness issues, but maybe not so much as people think of them. There are very few character and fitness issues that pull up the gate to the castle. In other words, 49 out of every 50 character and fitness messages we get don't keep someone out of law school, probably more than that. right? Because usually it's a felony compounded by a lie or something like that would really just cause a law school to say, I'm not going to give this person a chance. Or 3 DUIs comes to mind, because I remember that was an application I saw in part of my previous life, which was reading applications, where we just couldn't pull the admit lever on someone with 3 DUIs. I don't say this in a normative, judgmental way. I just say this as a sort of a factual matter. There's a number of people walking around a number of law schools with 1 DUI. The reason being, I think understandably, I think fairly, anything in that category, doesn't show a pattern. And a pattern is what law schools often look for, because if there's a pattern, there's no reason to believe you won't commit something while you're in law school. So if you don't have a pattern, if you don't have a really heinous academic fraud, and when I say academic fraud, people get really worried, I mean a pattern of that. The way the character and fitness would actually ding you would be if you don't take ownership of it. There are far more people not admitted to schools because their character and fitness addenda are poor than the character or fitness issue itself. That's an interesting fact, but it's true. So what I mean by that is, if you're like, man, that police officer had it out for me, that professor had it out for me. In goodness, I've seen a few cases where someone says both, right? Their GPA addenda says, these faculty had it out for me, and their character and fitness say, well, this police officer had it out for me. That's like the surest fire way to not get admitted to any law schools. So that would be one, character and fitness, particularly in the sense of not taking ownership. The second one that comes to mind would be yield protect. It's become more of a trend in the last 10 years. And what I would say about yield protect is, there's a select group of schools that we see it more from. The classic phenotypic pattern would be, you have a 177 and a 3.95. They invite you to apply. They turn your application around quickly, and it's a wait list or a hold or a priority wait list. And you're saying, what in the world is wrong with my application? But the reality is they're betting that you're going to get into higher ranked schools and not go. And their calculation is that they're going to take the smallest of fractional hits on their selectivity, because yield is a portion of selectivity. So they would rather waitlist you and see what happens. So if you self-assess that you may have fallen prey to this kind of, hitting below your numbers, you were held, you were waitlisted, you were priority waitlisted, to me, this is an easy fix. Just stay in touch with the school from time to time, and I'll get to the third category very soon. Stay in touch with the school, let them know why you're interested. And if you're staying in touch with them, they get less and less worried about whether they'll land you or not. Certainly don't stay in touch and be like, I got into Harvard, but I'm still interested in your school, because then they're going to have the same worry. But stay in touch and just say, when I was 18, I happened to walk by the law school and students talked to me and it was wonderful. Or I happened to catch Professor so-and-so's bio and their scholarship, their research is exactly what I want to be doing, etc. That's a great way to get off of a yield protect waitlist or hold. So you have to show some interest, but the other category is certainly another reason why schools might be wary of you. And, I hope this sets in for people who are doing it. The best way I can describe this, and I said this in a blog a few years ago, is it's kind of like a dating analogy, and I hate dating analogies. They always strike me as slightly creepy. But if you've ever seen the movie Swingers, and the guy meets the woman at a bar, and then he goes home and leaves her 20 voicemails. And on the 21st call, she picks up and says, never call me again. Law schools go through that same sort of situation every year, where they just get overwhelmed by someone. And here's the heuristic. It's really simple. If what you have to reach out to the school adds any kind of update, any kind of value to your application, new job, new grades, new experience, and by new experience, I guess I could see this going south. But, you were invited to do something by some prestigious entity and you did a Zoom talk. That's a wonderful reason to stay in touch with a law school, and they will appreciate that sort of update. But think about that analogy I gave from the movie. If you're reaching out just because you're understandably anxious and you're using a response from the law school to make you less anxious, that's when you really need to full stop and not do it. Because sure, some admissions officer might say, wow, this poor person is really nervous. I better, get back in touch with them, calm them down. But if they're doing that 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 30 times in a cycle, you could easily get yourself on a underperforming list because they think of you as obsessive or overly neurotic, and you can't will yourself into law school with communication touch points. And what they're going to say is, man, this person's going to do the same thing to law firms. Not only are law firms or employers not going to hire this person, they're going to, think twice about coming to our school if we admit too many of these people. Or the faculty are going to be complaining about our admit profile. The phenotype of our admits are, if they become too obsessive, we hear from the faculty. So it's kind of weird. Like, you could not be in touch enough and get yield protected, or you could be in touch way too much and get in the underperform category. So, you sort of have to be in the middle. I certainly like people staying in touch with law schools, but it's for value-added reasons. So that's your heuristic. The final one I'm going to touch on, and then I'm going to get to some of these questions, is sloppiness. Now, sloppiness, again, sort of like the CNF. Most of the times, if you have 1, 2, 5 typos, schools don't really care that much. And the reason why they don't care is because, going back to when I was on the other side of things and doing admissions, I would say 1% or less of applications had 0 flaws in them. That was me picking up the flaws. So probably even, there were times I read applications with typos, I didn't even see them. You get very desensitized to a few typos. I could never see a scenario, I shouldn't say never, because maybe a school would have a new admissions dean who's just like so anti-typo. But it's incredibly rare that 2 to 4 to 5 typos would ever keep you out. But if your application is so utterly sloppy, and sadly we see a lot of this in admission, so there's 40 typos, you're spelling the school's name wrong the entire time, or good goodness, you're using the wrong school's name. You're applying to Princeton Law, but you're saying Starfleet Academy. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that, you could find yourself not admitted even if you're above school's 75th. Because the school might say, wow, this person thinks their numbers are so strong, they don't really care about us as a school. So they're just submitting the first thing they do. A classic pattern of this kind of mistake happens in September when people overemphasize what they think. If I get my application in September, I'll be one of the first to apply and the school will fall in love with me. So they sacrifice sloppiness for expediency, and that ends up hurting people. The happy news here, and again, I'm trying to make this as value added as possible, is if you go back and you notice a grotesque mistake in your personal statement, you said the wrong school name, and you haven't had a decision yet, just say, I'm really interested in your law school. So much so I decided to redo my personal statement a little bit. You're sending it to someone who's highly likely not going to be reading your application anyways. They're just going to put it into your application. And in most scenarios, no one's going to see your former personal statement, your former resume, your former character and fitness. So some of these things, particularly if you haven't had a decision, can be fixed. So I covered sort of the 4 most common reasons that people underperform. Let me get to some of the questions. I am just going to read the relevant questions in the Reddit thread. There were a lot of questions. A few of them weren't really relevant in respect to the answering the question, am I underperforming my numbers? So I might not have time to touch on those, but I'm going to try. I've answered 2, but the next one that comes up is it the essay or lack of an added essay, parenthetically DS, diversity statement, that throws off an entire application? Well, no. To be clear, and maybe I should have said this earlier, I'm not really talking about splitters and reverse splitters where, let's say the school has a median LSAT of a 165 and you have a 167. And let's say the school has a median GPA of a 3.5 and you have a 3.47. You might get admitted or you might not. And in this scenario, maybe an additional wonderful essay could put you over the top. But I'm really talking about that school with a 165 and a 3.5, and you have a 168 and a 3.8, and you're not admitted. So a lack of additional essay is not the issue here. Because if you think about it, while additional essays are helpful, for sure, they paint a more broad picture, a more colorful picture, they're also causing more work for the admissions office who's having to read, 50 applications a day, each person, and each application is like 12 pages. You can do the math. That's a lot of work. So that wouldn't be the cause. Now, if a school has optional essays and you answer none of them, then we're going right back to that yield protection category. They might say, yeah, this person is not interested in our school. We gave them 7 optional essays. They have a 177 and a 3.9, and they didn't take the time to answer one of the 7. They might want to go to a higher ranked school. But it wouldn't be something, if you were close to the numbers. It would be more if it was an optional essay and you were well above the numbers. The next question, and I apologize if there's squeaking noises in the background. That's my dog, Loki. Is having a non-legal job in Biglaw going in a boost as schools see you connections that may help boost the school standing? I guess that doesn't really fall into the category of underperforming. Work experience helps. So this is a small differentiating factor. I don't really know if the connections are going to help. I think too often people think they have influential connections where the school is kind of like, well, we have 2,000 other people with similar connections or 1,000 other people who have also no lawyers. So I don't think that it's the connections, but work experience should make you a more poised professional. But this sort of bleeds in well with the next question, which is, how disadvantaged are KJDs in the admissions process? That's a really good question. If you think about it like this, if everyone who applied to law school was a KJD, you wouldn't be disadvantaged at all. Conversely, if everyone who applied to law school had work experience, you might actually be advantaged. Because to me, differentiation is just the one word that sums up law school admissions. I will put it in context of this application cycle. In this cycle, I could see more people KJD, just for anyone who doesn't know, that means essentially going straight from kindergarten to law school, not graduating and working for a few years or not taking a gap year after high school. What I would say is, if you've gone KJD, if you spent hours on end in the library and you have a 4.0 and you're 17 years old and you've graduated, and incidentally, we once had an application at one of the schools I worked at from a 12-year-old. If you've, done nothing in your free time but study, I hate to say it like this because I have a lot of respect for these people because I was not one of them. Well, I was in business school, but not in undergrad. Yeah, I think you're going to be disadvantaged, and I think you're going to be disadvantaged more this cycle than in previous cycles because it's competitive and it's a seller's market. So schools have more ability to say no to people this cycle. But if you were KJD and were involved in a lot of group activities or work during college, you're totally fine. That would not be a reason why you would underperform, target medians of the schools. Do GRE applicants more often underperform their numbers? With the high LSAT saturation, will this negatively affect GRE applicants? No, I think it's going to be the same pattern as we've seen, which is if you're a GRE applicant, and that does factor into your U.S. News and World Report, we have a long-winded blog, a very nuanced blog on that. It just doesn't factor in at this stage in the GRE life cycle evolution nearly as much as LSAT. I think you're going to have a slower cycle, but you're not going to have a worse cycle. So someone with a very high GRE and a GPA at the school's target or above the school's target GPA, you should be fine. I don't think the GRE is going to hurt you. And by underperforming, I'm generally talking about there's something in your application that's hurting you, but it is going to make it slower. So that's been the same in the last few years of the GRE, no different. And every year that'll get ameliorated a little bit more. Considering how some services quantify the URM Boost in applications, well, you actually can't quantify. So again, they're talking about these predictor sites based on limited historic data. There is a boost, and it differs from school to school. For some school, that boost might be +3 LSAT. For some, it might be +10 LSAT. But the question that I really just want to touch on is what specifically causes URMs to underperform their stats? Well, hopefully I answer part of that. You may have a misinterpretation of what that boost is because we can't really know it for each individual school. But the other way I would answer that is all those things I talked about at the beginning of the podcast, the character and fitness, the yield protection, the obsessiveness, the sloppiness. If anyone at URM or not URM is committing those, then they're going to underperform their numbers. So let me just be hopefully assuring. There's nothing I foresee in the URM category that's going to hurt you. Now, you could see a scenario where if, let's say you're Latinx and application increases in the Latinx category are up 200%, you've done nothing wrong, obviously, but there's just a lot more ability for law schools to sort of raise selectivity in that area. But I haven't, LSAC tweeted once that applicants of color are driving this cycle's increase. But that was really a misleading tweet because when we saw that tweet, we went in and did the math and we were talking about several hundreds of people, not thousands. So it was a small factor in a cycle where there are many larger factors driving the application increase. If you're underperforming your numbers in your URM, it has nothing to do this cycle with you being URM and everything to do with maybe pulling one of those levers I touched upon. Hopefully that was helpful. Someone mentioned being rejected by University of Michigan. It's really tough for me to talk about individual schools. If it's one school, I don't necessarily see it as a leading indicator, not the words the question asked. Again, it's hard for me to speak to any individual school. I just don't see it as a leading indicator. So I wouldn't worry about any one school data point. Any data longitudinal studies on engineers? Well, yes, but I'm dating myself because I haven't looked at that data in years. The last time I looked at it, the highest percentage, not aggregate, but percentage major admitted was physics. Why is that? Two reasons. Physics majors differentiate, right? There's a lot more political science people applying to law school than physics. And physics majors tended to do well in the LSAT. I'm going to guess that there's probably some overlap from the data I've seen where an engineering major, while that's not going to be this like plus, plus, plus on the scale, it might be a feather on the scale in the positive direction, not the negative direction. This next question I love because the person's speaking my language. So seeking no debt as a really precise question. I'm sure this will vary by schools. Always a good way to start because it's true. But in your experience as someone who's made decisions on files, if a candidate is at above both schools' target medians and has demonstrated genuine interest, how much can these two factors carry them if the rest of the application is average? So I guess, it depends on what average means, but if it's truly average at the sort of midpoint of good and bad, and you show real interest in the school and you're above their target medians, enjoy your admit. I don't think any average application with those other two variables is going to in any way turn you into underperforming being above their target medians. Would you say if there are multiple LSAT scores without a consistent increase in score, i.e. there was a score drop before the ultimate high score, then is that person likely to underperform, especially asking for T6, T14, and would the answer change if the final score is a 175 plus? This was the number one mythology in law school admissions for many years, was that school's average scores. And finally, with a lot of time and awareness, that mythology kind of went away. I've taken the LSAT 3 or 4 times. I have a 160, a 165, a 170, and a 175. The fact of the matter is the only number that gets calculated in U.S. News and World Report rankings is that 175. No other score goes to U.S. News or World Report rankings. It's kind of no different than if your professor says, I'm going to give you 4 tests and your highest grade is the grade on the class. There's tons of messaging about holistic reviews and so forth, which is understandable because lots of schools try to read applications holistically. They try to read every word in the application, including they see every LSAT score. But think about it in these terms. If you're the dean of admission, your boss, anyone who has a boss can relate to the fact that your boss is sort of the center of your professional galaxy. You please her or him and your career goes up. You disappoint her or him and your career goes down. If your boss is saying, I want a 174 LSAT this year, and you're denying that person because their first take was a 165 and their last take was a 175, and your competition schools aren't doing that, then your job is going to be in jeopardy over time because your LSAT's going down and their LSAT's going up. So sure, there are schools at the top that get so many high LSAT scores. Maybe they are afforded more ability to say, wow, this person took the LSAT 4 times. 3 of their scores are 160. 1 of their scores is a 175. But we have such a surplus of 175s that we'll take the person that took it once and got a 175. But I think that scenario happens a lot less often. In most cases, schools are really honed in on that high LSAT score. Hopefully that'll put a lot of people's minds to rest. Okay, I think I answered, if not in this podcast, in the thread too, just about hopefully every question. And hopefully, again, there were some takeaways that things people can do. Particularly, if you're denied, you should know that you can always ask for a reconsideration. And even if you were yield protection denied, even asking for a reconsideration shows interest. Now, often with reconsideration, something has to change, though, like an LSAT score. But if the LSAT score has to change, that probably means you're not underperforming your numbers. You just need a higher LSAT. Right now, currently, as of this morning, applications are up 30%. Let me go back to that page. And applicants are up 20%. Now, here's what's going to happen. January test takers were up. And February registrants right now are about twice as many as last year. At this point last year, we were 56% done with the cycle. 56% of applications were submitted. Probably higher this cycle point. I'm just going to make up a number, but we'll call it 60%. We're going to see for the next 2.5 months increases that look scary. So the number of applications may go up, but the number of applicants will certainly go up from 20%, maybe back up to 30, even 35%. And then for the rest of the summer, because of that front loading I just alluded to, right? We're not 56% done with the cycle, we're 60 or 65% done. For the rest of the summer, so we'll call it mid-March till August, these numbers are going to come back down. Probably we will finish the cycle around 25% increase in applicants or 20% increase in applicants, which means this is an anomalistically competitive cycle. There are people who are above medians who won't get admitted to certain schools for the reasons I mentioned, incidentally. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other reason, although there probably are. So some of those reasons are amendable and fixable. And hopefully that's the value-added takeaway of this podcast, is that some of these things you can do now if you've been held or waitlisted. I hope this was helpful. I know this is a long, hard cycle. And I feel it too, incidentally, and my team feels it too. Not as much as you all, and I understand how anxiety-producing this cycle can be. I do think these numbers, while they are going to go up in the short term, are going to start coming down slowly and very steadily. So there's a lot of waitlisted or particularly held people who haven't had decisions yet, who are going to get some happy decisions. And I try to end on an optimistic but realistic note, and that to me is both optimistic and realistic. This was Mike Spivey of the Spivey Consulting Group.